Can you hear me? For those who don't know me, my name is Brian Scott. I'm Chair of the Board of Mediation Northern Ireland. I want to welcome everyone to our meeting here today, our conference. The topic for today is the art and soul of civic leadership. I think when we look around the world today and over the last 10 years or so and survey the wreckage that our esteemed leaders in the Western world anyway have made of our hopes, of our livelihoods, our homes, I think we can conclude that leadership is a feature sadly wanting. There is a great shortage throughout our societies and our communities. So maybe it's up to civil society, civic society to step up and demonstrate leadership, exercise leadership, innovation, creativity, and that's what we'll be discussing here today. We've got two excellent and notable speakers. The first is Professor Paul Lederach. I think well known to many, most, perhaps all of us, and his several books on leadership, mediation, etc. And Professor Paul Arthur is going to speak after the break and discuss. Paul is University of Ulster, has written and participated extensively in our own local troubles and civic issues, and I'm sure he'll have lots to say. So the format is Paul will speak. We will then have an opportunity in our respective tables to discuss what he has had to say, to formulate some questions and comments for about half an hour. And then Paul will be available, Paul will be available to discuss these with us. Unfortunately, he has an airplane to catch and he has to leave at 11 o'clock, which is why we started a little bleary-eyedly at this time of the morning. So without further ado, Paul, you're very welcome, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be back. I want to make sure you can hear my voice. It's a little rough this morning. So can you hear me at that back table over there? Is it okay? Just whoever's running the system, if you can crank it up. Is that Colin over here? In fact, I don't think this microphone's on. If the microphone's not on, I'll move it away and just shout. It wasn't turned on. Is that easier? Okay. You see, the art and soul of imaginative leadership is to know when to push the button. I'm very happy to be back in Belfast and to have this opportunity with you this morning. My topic relates to particularly a book that I've been working on for some time and that some of you have been working with here with Mediation Northern Ireland, which was The Moral Imagination, the Art and Soul of Building Peace. Today my challenge is to shift the focus ever so slightly toward the question of leadership, and in particular civic leadership, and how some of the ideas of the moral imagination may in fact relate very directly to that kind of leadership. I quoted Einstein in the book at one point. In one of his, Einstein always had this capacity to capture something that really sticks with you, but was provocative always. And he said at one point, logic will take you from A to B. Imagination will take you everywhere. And it's that sort of thing that, in the end, I will attempt to get at, which is how do we go from situations where we may feel bound, tied to a certain set of parameters, and with little leeway of breaking out. The context when I originally was writing the book was one that you here would be very familiar with, which is settings of protracted conflict with many cycles of violence that had repeated themselves, if not over years and decades, even generations. And the question that I was attempting to get at is, how did people break out of those cycles of violence while still living in them? I mean, one of the big difficulties that we face in so many places is that these things are ongoing, and you don't have the luxury of saying, stop everything and then we'll figure it out. You have to do it while it's still happening, still evolving. So that was the impulse of the original work. The focus this morning is more toward the challenge of democracy and leadership. And I'm going to make an assumption about my audience, which may or may not be accurate, but I'll simply lay it out so that you know some of what I was thinking about when I initiated these notes and comments. My understanding is that a lot of you are coming from positions of leadership, but that you are embedded in ongoing institutional work or sectors or particular areas where you find yourselves responding to the political processes, but responsible for delivering services of one form or another. And by virtue of that, we have somewhat of a mix in the room, but my thought was to place attention in particular on people who are working within institutional contexts and or organizational contexts that have inherent to them certain structures that are in place and certain hierarchies of decision making, and by virtue of that, some sense at times of limitation. So where I'm focusing this is toward how to bring this kind of imaginative leadership to settings where we may feel that we have little flexibility for all that we might want to do. And that's one of the challenges that I'll try to address this morning. I think that the challenge of democracy really faces ever more in our global situation. This is certainly true in our home country, in the United States. Two very significant challenges. The first is what I would call the gravitas. I'm using that as a form of the weight that pulls things down. So the gravitas of mediocrity. And I'll come back to say a few words about that. The second challenge is the challenge of the divisive push and pull of partisan politics that is the overlay and at times the underpinning of most everything that is done. So a few comments about those two challenges before we go into some reflections about the art and soul of leadership that attempts to incite the imagination. Gravitas of mediocrity. From where exactly does this come? I think that, at least in my experience, we see three areas that tend to create this, what I would, and I'm not sure the word mediocrity is the best, but it's one to provoke the thinking. The first is that in the back and forth within a democracy, we tend to move to the lowest common denominator quite often in decision making. That is, between the fights that are happening about what direction to go, how to structure politics, what decisions to make, what public policies to pursue, when there is a very significant difference of opinion, the fallback position that often ends up being the one chosen is one of compromise. And that compromise tends to pull down toward the lowest common denominators. We basically get tired of fighting, and we choose the halfway point. These are not always the most imaginative or the most useful of the decisions that we may need for public life. And it's one of the big challenges that I think we face. It's not uncommon for many of you who are here from the fields of working with conflict and, in particular, mediation. We know that it is not unfamiliar territory that people simply get tired of fighting. I sometimes think that the proper word for our field is not conflict resolution or conflict transformation, it's conflict exhaustion. We just simply get tired of it all, and at some point it pulls it down to a decision where you may reach something that permits it to move forward, but it's not the most imaginative of the things that may be reached. The second is, especially these next two are especially for those of you found within institutions and or organizations. And I think the gravitas that I was referring to for these settings really have to do with two phrases that we often hear. The first is that over the long haul, institutional life can wear you down a bit. You discover after a long period of time that the best and most safe way to proceed is just to get by. Do what needs to be done to deliver what has to be delivered, but not necessarily attempt or engage in ways that may be much more imaginative. And this is not an uncommon thing, that people will, after a period of time, tend toward getting by in a way that delivers what's there, but not always bring everything that they might to that, given the years of experience and the hard bumps that they have had in attempting things that may have tried to break out. I come from the background of sociology, and within sociology, one of the most prominent authors historically was Max Weber. And Weber, of course, had a very concrete view of bureaucracies in which he said they tend to live in order to reproduce themselves at a certain point. And it requires a way in which things just move along without much change. It's hard to get the big ship to change. The third one that I note is also within the institutional experience, which is a very common phrase that I hear from people, that my capacity to think outside the box and creatively is very limited. We really have no space for doing more than the day-to-day grind of what has to be delivered. And if we do have a strategic planning meeting on a Friday afternoon, it often is limited in its time duration, and it often encourages some ideas to come out, but they're very hard to follow up on, because the real thrust of this is that we have to protect what it is that we're doing, and we have to deliver the things that we do, and that takes up all of our time and energy, and it's too much of a risk to step into something that moves us well beyond those parameters. So you have the let's just get by effect, and you have there's no space for creativity, critique that often comes. And I would refer to these as the gravitas of mediocrity. This is, I hope you recognize that I'm attempting to provoke a discussion today. You may completely disagree with me, and that would be most welcome. Now, let's move to the second one. What are the divisive push and pulls of partisan politics within which the organizations and institutional life must function in a democracy? And here I think we could, of course, look at conflict more generally, or we could look specifically at those settings that have had very significant periods of violence and deep social division, identity division, most often in a lot of places. Though my own speculation is that increasingly most of the democracies of the world face a much higher level of division in partisan politics that has become ever more robust and extreme in its expression than we have seen over the last maybe 50 years. And this is driven by a lot of factors, but not the least of which is that we now live in a global community, a much more well-defined understanding of the movement of people, of the ways that we have interdependence, and that there are within local politics a significant amount of fear about what's coming in from the outside and a wanting to control that. And this often then creates points of significant tension around identities. And when this gets transferred into the political sphere, and in particular into political parties, we often find very divisive partisan politics around public policy. and especially in periods of elections. Now, one way to understand the push and pull of this is simply to go back to some of the keys that we know about the dynamics of the escalation of conflict. And I think within the context that I'm referring to, conflict dynamics have at least four kinds of, I'll use the word power, there are four kinds of ways in which they impact and influence social settings. And I'm thinking here very specifically in reference to the push and pull around partisan politics. That is, the ways in which politics is framed of one party against another, and often there are forms of identity that divide those. The first is the power of sides. And the power of sides is that as conflict escalates, people feel this push to take one side or the other. And it's often framed as either or choices. You're either with us or you're against us. And it reduces the ground that is in the middle. So that people who may have been moving across, seeing perspectives from both, are often required or obligated to choose up which direction they'll be. Who will they be with? This, of course, is not unfamiliar territory for those of you here in this part of the world. I have not been here as often as I was in the 1990s. Obviously, that was a period of time where there was a great deal of conflict that still took the form of open and direct violence. That's been reduced, but we've also noticed, very interestingly, that there has been a significant reduction in the middle ground in terms of politics in this area of the world. That is, that there was a reducing of the various kinds of political formations that created a kind of an effort to bridge, and there's been an ever more push to one side or the other. But this is very common in a lot of places. So in our part of the world, we are, of course, living through this in terms of the recent push of the Tea Party. The Republican-Democratic divide is become ever more ferocious, and it is very much the power of the sides. Whose side are you on? The second is the power of towing the line. What do I mean by this? When conflict begins to escalate, we find rather typically that people have conversations only with those with whom they agree. And very seldom do they have conversations that are significant with people from other perspectives. What this creates, and the reason why I'm using the word towing the line, is it creates conversations with predetermined outcomes. We already know more or less what it is that we think, and we just find the people we need to agree with it. And those who may think outside of that predetermined outcome feel an enormous pressure to bring it back in line, that is, to toe the line. And it goes back to the sides. If you start to express something that's different from your particular group that you may be close to, you will feel that pressure to come back to the fold, if you will. So one of the things that happens is it really raises the question about what's the quality of conversation we're having. If the conversations we're having are mostly with people with whom we already agree, and rare occasions of a significant and important dialogue with those with whom we disagree, it really raises a very interesting question about the impact of this division that is the push and pull of politics. The third power is the power of fear. And the power of fear, I think, is essentially about the fear of stepping out too far. And that if you step out too far, it will bring the wrath of a good beating. Now, literally, in the period of the Troubles, those were quite literal. People that stepped too far in one direction or another found themselves drawn immediately back into line, often with the use of violence. There may be less direct violence, but I think we still have an enormous challenge in the fact that conflict and division creates a lot of fear, and that we operate in a world of fear. And the fear is to go too far, to say the wrong thing. There may be, especially in the world of the the political and the highly public political arena, the very cautious use of ways that you may explore options and ideas that are quite different from those that had been agreed earlier, because you will feel the backlash of whatever it is that you may be suggesting. And so it reduces, the fear tends to reduce the capacity to explore a wide range of options. And the fourth power that I would mention, which I think is about the push and pull of partisan politics, is the power of blaming. And the power of blaming, as I understand it, is really about never saying that it is our responsibility. Essentially, a lot of what happens in blaming is that the responsibility for things not working is passed over to somebody else. So that we minimize, as divisions are sharp at a social level, we minimize the responsibility we may have, the accountability that we may have, and we maximize the accountability that the other has, which takes the form of blame. And the system that evolves out of that, I think, is a system where there is a significant reduction of responsibility and accountability. In fact, it is the disappearance of honesty in the public sphere. Because being honest is too risky. If I say I was wrong, that could be the end of my career. And so we live in a world where there is very little capacity at the level of partisan politics to have an honest conversation about responsibility and accountability. This is not an easy thing for any of us. I think it's doubly difficult for those who are in the public limelight. So those are the four powers. Now, to me, these two things, the gravitas of mediocrity and the divisive push and pull of partisan politics, these in some ways form the challenges that the imaginative civic leadership has to engage. So how might we do this? And more specifically, what are some of the things that underpin the approaches? So I want to go back to a place that when I first began writing the book, The Moral Imagination, I debated a lot about the use of the word moral. And I had a lot of people, not the least of which was from this part of the world, who debated this with me. And the debate ran something like the following. The word moral is a loaded term. And it comes loaded particularly with a range of religious connotations. And the religious connotations are that morality, or the word moral, is often used to promote a certain form of dogmatic belief. And everything you're talking about in the book is actually the opposite of a dogmatic belief, a dogmatic, narrowly structured, limited ways of understanding decisions and approach. And that, in fact, the word moral may get in the way of that. Now, I had, the book itself was built around a number of stories. What I had noticed after about 25 years of work in this field of peace building in different parts of the world had created a kind of a personal crisis, to be honest about it. So the personal crisis was the following: that I had worked a lot and very hard in a lot of places, and yet the most interesting things that happened had nothing to do with the work we were doing. That is, that there were spontaneous expressions of sets of people who, emergent in a context of great violence, did extraordinary things, but they had very little relationship to the big efforts that we were making. And so I had 2 points of inquiry. One was the personal side, which is it still worth doing any of this? Because maybe you just let it all emerge spontaneously. And the other was to try to identify what seemed to be the core essences of when these unbelievable expressions that broke out of cycles of violence happened. What were the things that were core to that set of things happening? And I landed on 4 or 5 stories that I tell at the beginning of the book. They're from Africa, Latin America, Central Asia. They're from different parts of the world. And I landed on 4 basic ideas that I thought constituted this notion, and it helps me get to why it was that I chose the word moral. The 4 essences that I located was that the first was that there had to be a real commitment to relationship, but an understanding of a web of relationships that included your enemy. That people who found a way to break out of violence had an innate capacity somehow to recognize that the well-being of their grandchildren was tied to the well-being of their enemies' grandchildren. And there was no way to avoid having some form in which the relationship and that web of relationship had to be engaged. The second was that they had, I used several terms for this, but one of them was they had a kind of a sustained curiosity. They were always curious about what was happening, what other people were thinking, and the notion that it was possible to, in fact, be curious about the views of the other. And that this curiosity led them to forms of engagement where they more carefully considered how it was that people could have such different views that led all the way to the use of violence. I made some case that this kind of curiosity requires you to break out of the either-or understanding. That is, that when you think about things dualistically, that it's either with us or against us, or for this or opposed to this, that narrows things to only 2 choices. Curiosity keeps a lot of things alive. You're curious about a lot of things. The third area was the subtitle of the book itself, The Art and Soul. The third area was that I noticed how creative people were, and that in some ways what they did, they were almost like artisans of social change. And that began for me a process that has continued up until today, and I'm sure will carry through most of the rest of my life, which is to figure out how and in what ways we might understand challenges like deep-rooted conflict or promoting democracy, how we might understand those as requiring an artistic process and not just a technical management process. And that so many of my colleagues were mostly concerned about technical management. What are the 4 steps to doing, X, whatever it is that X may be? And so you give the 4 steps, people learn them, and then they think that's what they're doing. In reality, when people break out of deep cycles of violence, they're bringing into existence something that does not now exist. That is, they're artists. And that's the essence of art. So I became very much interested in how we might enhance the artistic component of this sort of activity, as opposed to simply the component of technical management. The fourth was that I noticed in each and every instance that there was considerable risk, and that people, when they took the risk, sometimes were very cognizant of how much of a risk it was, and sometimes were not completely cognizant of all that it might imply. But what they did was they took the step that they felt compelled that they needed to take. They didn't take the whole journey, they took the step. But that step, in and of itself, was a risk. And that change never happens without a risk. And so these 4 combined, I began to refer to as, now coming back to my term, the moral imagination. And the reason why that I wanted to stay with that term had 2 elements. The first was that there was a quality of transcendence, which is another way that the word moral can be used. Quality of transcendence that we would hear would be examples of when people chose to do something unexpected. And the way that they chose to do that thing that was not expected transformed the whole of the situation. And when people referred to that, they sometimes referred to it as they took a higher moral ground. And that notion of the higher had this quality of coming up and out of all the things that hold you down and impacted into a situation, to step beyond it. It has this transcendent quality. Now sometimes, and most times, people did not articulate it in such terms. They simply did things like went to visit In the case of the campesinos in Colombia, they went to visit those who they most feared. Okay? Now, that risk that they took began to transform a range of things in their context, but they were moving up and out beyond the parameters that held them down. The second is that there was a part of this that also referred to, and here again often the word moral is used, that the moral weight of their way of being, their way of speaking to truth, that there was a component of that that had something very concrete that led to people using, in a number of instances, the word moral, but it was tied to the courage to speak truth in situations where it's not wanted, not encouraged, or that it's considerably risky. Last night we heard the song built around Seamus Heaney's famous line, whatever you say nothing. This particular moral weight is a bit the opposite of that. Whatever you say, speak to the deepest truth that you know, but don't impose it. Bring it and hold it. Now, this would be the notion then that is about the word moral, but reframed in a way that is very little to do with dogmatism, very little to do with limiting and narrowing norms and or points of behavior, but have a lot to do with transcendence and truth. So that was where I was headed with that termination. What I think it leads to, among other things, is that it begins to bring forward the potential for the unexpected. And I think the potential for the unexpected is often the combination of these things: relationship, curiosity, creativity, and risk. Nurture or give birth to something that does not, at this point, exist. Now, this would lead to the two words in our subtitle today that I'm working with, which is art and soul. I had, coming back to the word art, my concern was about how to think about what we're doing in reference to the process of constructively engaging conflict in a way that had components that permitted us to think about that as an artistic process. That is, bringing into existence something that does not yet exist. I started paying a lot of attention to artists. I'm assuming there's probably a range of artists actually in this audience. I know a few last night were poets and musicians that I was with, so you probably have some feel of this. I started paying attention to the way artists talked about what they did, and usually they had difficulty saying it because their view was the art speaks for itself. So if I speak to it, I diminish the very thing that I'm doing. So it's a complicated engagement to talk about how it was that something emerged. But it was, in fact, parenthetically, I'm going to diverge for a moment because one of the points of interest that I had that came out in a very recent book, just in the last year that's been published, was the music of Van Morrison, who I usually find when I mention in this part of the world, you either have a love or hate relationship with the guy. But I read extensively the 8 or 10 biographies that had been written about him. And every biography, the biographer was attempting the same thing, which was to get out of Van Morrison his view of what he was doing, his music. And he was, he's a cantankerous soul. So as much as he gives us in the direction of meditative music and a range of other things about the betterment of humanity, he's not always been the example of the immoral imagination in his personal relationships, and which tend to come across in his relationships with all of his biographers, who almost to a T come to dislike him personally, love his music and dislike him personally. That's the essence of all the biographies. And in the case of that, the question that they keep asking him, that they would push him on, was, explain your music. Where does it come? And he would consistently say, I can't. I can't. The music speaks for itself. And he would, then he'd usually go on a tirade of one sort or another, so then kind of got lost in other things that were happening. But you find this to be true quite consistently with a lot of artists. And then occasionally you get a little snippet. So for example, just recently, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel released an hour-long documentary that was about their music in the 1960s and 70s. But in particular, they focused on the song Bridge Over Troubled Water. And Paul Simon, in one or two of his interviews, just makes a very small reflection that says, I don't know where that came from. All I know is that in 1 minute I was sitting and strumming, and in the next minute I had sang the words, like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down. 1 minute it did not exist, and the next minute it did, and of course that traveled globally, that particular phrase. You can almost go anywhere in the world and people will know that particular song. One of the interviews pushing him about, again, where this came from, and his views had to do with the connection between art and soul. That there's something deep and something transcendent that happens in the artistic process. And I'm not sure that we have all the scientific explanations of that. There's a lot of effort to try to understand the science of creativity. But there seems to me to be rather consistently a connection between these two things. And so when I speak of art, I'm speaking to creativity, ways of breaking forward into something new that 1 minute did not exist and the next minute begins to take form and shape. And I'm speaking to soul. That is, that it begins to touch a deeper place within ourselves of who we are, not what we do. And that maybe one of the most important components of a creative civic leadership is the quality of people that we choose to be. The presence and the quality of presence that we bring to who we are in the places where we work and deliver services. And that this requires engagements that go beyond technical management because they begin to nurture, and these are the words that I'll be working with here in the last 10 minutes of this talk, they begin to nurture authenticity and sustained engagement. So, how exactly do we get to this more practically? My remaining comments will focus on a number of suggestions, again, sort of in the direction of provoking the conversation here today. So you may find these add something to what you're thinking about. You may find some reaction against them, but it will take you to a place where you add something on from your own side. I'd like to place these into a couple of different categories. So the first one, around thinking more practically about the art and soul of civic leadership, is that I think we have to recognize that this kind of leadership requires us to cross 3 different kinds of boundaries or borders. And we may not always think about these in explicit ways, so I'd like to lift them out and simply put them onto a table so that we could have a conversation about it. I think the first border or boundary that has to be crossed is the one that lies within the person, within ourselves. And it is the border of the fear to try something different. Now, where I first bumped into this, and it has, so I want to go back to a couple of words that are quite common in the work that I have been engaged with and that I hear occasionally here. It was the word empowerment. Quite often in Central America where I was working, a lot of the programs that were aimed at development or even education or other kinds of agriculture, a whole range of applications it could be, was at the essence of it, it was about empowering people. And the way that got translated in Spanish was through a verb that we don't exactly have in the same form in English, which was capacitarse. So the word capaz is the word to be able. Okay, it would be one way that we might translate that. But it actually held a significant component that related to the notion of empowerment. And the essence of what you began to discover was that there was a shift in people. And this shift was very subtle. But it was the shift from I am not capable or able to I am. And that often came from the notion of I cannot to I can. Now, I think that may be one of the most significant components of the internal boundaries that we create for ourselves. The way I see it is that fear tends to mitigate against the belief that I can do something different or that I can innovate. And by that, it creates a kind of self-limitation. So one of the first boundaries that we have to cross is actually the boundary about self-belief, about who we are in the places where we're located and what we think we can contribute. One of the things I've done rather consistently with my students, and I try to do it in workshops that I'm doing with people, is I ask people to think about themselves as a gift. What would this world be without if you were not here? What gift would we be missing? Now, a lot of times it's not a single gift, but it is about shifting the notion toward the direction that you begin to envision yourself as bringing and holding something that without which we would be a much poorer community. Now, that first boundary, I think, has a lot to do with the fears that we create for ourselves. So how we deal with beginning to face the fear of trying, I think, is one of the most significant components of imaginative civic leadership. What I find is that after many years, people have come to a place where they more or less are saying, we've tried before and it's too painful, it doesn't work, it didn't go, we bumped our heads, whatever the range of reasons may be, but it then is a self-censoring fear of trying. So it's the first boundary to cross. The second is within institutions. Now, the main thing that I find here is that people have perceptions about limitations, but the perceptions are not always accurate. And the perceptions are that nothing's possible. And so we tend to have a lot of wait and see, or wait for direction, or wait for orders, or wait for somebody to come up with something different that they tell us we can do. So there's a lot of this kind of wait until. And one of the things that I would push on is that this is a border, a boundary that we have to cross, and it's the boundary of perceived limitations. And the only way that I know to test the boundary of perceived limitations is to keep trying. You keep trying a few things. And as you keep trying, you begin to test, it's kind of a reality test, you begin to test how limited or not certain things may be, or a new reframing of an idea that didn't work before may be cast in a way that now can move in ways that are unexpected, etc. But what you do is that you begin to test the perception that everything is limited, rather than accepting that everything is limited because that's just the way things are. Just the way things are. And I think this, of course, is one of the big boundaries we have to cross. How we view our institutions and how we view ourselves as people who participate in these institutions, and how these institutions and what we do meets and provides the kinds of services and needs of the wider public. The third area or boundary is I think we need to cross the boundary of partisan divides. And this one, of course, is particularly significant in places where those have been deep and long-lasting, because they are not easily going away. I'll come back to that in a moment. What I'd like to say now is what are a few of the strategies. And I'm going to go to one very specific one that I'd like to suggest that I think was visible in the cases that I explored in the moral imagination and those that I've seen since. So the strategy is crossing borders by taking a small step, risking one step at a time. And it starts with a fairly simple kind of an idea. I think every great journey always starts with a small step. Secondly, I would add to that the subtitle of Mohandas Gandhi's autobiography, which I found to be one of the most intriguing subtitles that I've ever read. His subtitle was My Experiments with Truth. That was how he titled his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. So, small step and experiments with truth. How might you visualize that if you're embedded in an institution as a civic leader? What you would begin to ask is, what are the things that I feel deeply may offer something new and innovative for what we're doing, but currently it does not exist? What would be the small step? Now, experiments would say that you're going to take the approach. Now, experimentation means rarely that you arrive the first time when you do it. It simply turns out the way you think it is. That's what an experiment is, that you're testing, you're trying, you're offering. And when that is done and it meets resistance or it fails, you don't give up. Okay, now, this is the basic notion of experiment, according to, most of you, I'm sure, have had at one point or another a penicillin shot or gone to a doctor for a particular treatment. Now, if the doctors and the scientists had given up after one or two tries on their experiments, we would have very little of what we know in modern medicine. In fact, the whole scientific endeavor is built on the idea that you actually set up what you're experimenting with in order to fail, so that you learn from it. And if it doesn't fail, you try it again until you can make it fail. And if it doesn't fail, you may be on to something. Right? So the notion of the experiment is that you create if you will, an imagination that has an idea of something you're trying to get to, but a willingness to keep trying. So that's what I would make the argument for, is that Gandhi, for example, was very adept at this. If you wanted to sum up the whole of his autobiography in about 3 short sentences or 4, it would be this. He noticed, and he noticed things that weren't right. He engaged, he had an idea, and he took a step. If it didn't work, he tried it a different way. Now, eventually this translated into a very significant social movement of change that brought the independence of India. But he didn't start out with the independence of India as the immediate thing that was accomplished. He was constantly experimenting and constantly noticing, constantly engaging. So what's the strategy? Notice and try. Start small, one step at a time. Don't give up, and find some allies. I think this works better if you can find a small team of people that you might link to. I don't think Lone Rangers work very well. They usually get shot. So if you want to be a Lone Ranger, you can give it a try, but you're likely to get shot down off the white horse all by yourself. So find allies. But that's a fairly simple set of ideas. And I think where the 3 boundaries we're crossing limit us, the first is self-limitation. We stop noticing, and if we do notice, we become cynical about it. So this would say notice and try. A small step. Sometimes we see something big and we don't think we can go there because it's too big, so we don't even take the first step. So what would something big require as a first step? and then a second step, and then a third step. And so it is basically a strategy of notice, try, start small, don't give up, find allies. That would be the essence of a small strategy to break through the 3 boundaries. Now, final comments. What might be some keys to nurturing an ethos of imagination? That is, an ethos means that creating an environment, a wider ethic, a wider, if you will, nurturing of an imagination that's capable of enhancing some of this. And here I have 4 short comments to make, and then I will conclude this. The first, I think that nurturing an ethos of imagination requires you to commit to relationships. But I want to make the case that it's not the normal kind of relationships. I think that what you have to commit you to is some form of engaged conversation with people who are not like you and don't think like you. So I have a very concrete suggestion, if you wanted to follow this, that you pursue at least one conversation a week with someone very different than yourself. One conversation a week with someone who, in the very act of relating to that person, requires you to move beyond your comfort zone. And that conversation is not taken up with the purpose that you will arrive at some agreement together. It's taken up with a commitment to be in conversation. The second, I think it requires a commitment to walk the path of what I would call sincerity. Now we're going to diverge for a moment into 3 or 4 words, and I'm going to give you a small Latin lesson. I'm sure that you all studied Latin and that you enjoyed it immensely in school, so here we go. Sincerity. The root of this word is so fascinating to me. It came from the period of the Roman Empire when they were building the massive buildings throughout the empire, especially in Rome and Italy. And they were using a lot of marble, slabs and slabs of marble that came into the pillars and into the chambers, etc. And so by virtue of that, there was quite a business of, mining and selling marble, stone. And when a person would buy the stone, they, of course, would buy it in one location. It could be transported to another, and then they would begin to work on it. The seller of the stone would sometimes hide the imperfections of that particular piece of marble by putting wax into cracks and then covering it with powder so that it looked absolutely perfect when you saw it. But once you started working on it, big chunks would cave off because there were fissures that hadn't been noticed because they were covered. Now, in Latin, the word sincerity emerges literally from the 2 parts that form this word. Sin, S-I-N, is without. And cera, C-E-R-A, is wax. Without wax. Without wax. That's to be sincere, to be sincera. They still say it in Spanish, same exact way. Now, what's interesting about that is that you basically, if you're sincere, you are with people who you are. You're not hiding things. But this then places you in a location of great vulnerability. So I want to do the Latin exploration of the word vulnerable. Vulneris goes back to the word in Latin originally that meant wound. Wound. And I think to be vulnerable means to carry a wound gracefully. Not to hide it, but to carry it gracefully. This is who I am. Okay? So this notion of sincerity connected to vulnerability is that you are who you are with people without hiding that imperfection. And this then takes us to the final 2 words that I'd like to have a brief exploration of. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage. Now the word courage goes back to the French language, and it goes to the word cœur, heart, to have heart. Courage meant to have heart, to bring your heart forward. And I think the courage is essentially this. it's the courage to be honest. I've increasingly come to believe that a truthful, a significant conversation is the thing that is most missing in our public sphere. People want to be in a place where they have the feeling, the sensation, that this is an honest, sincere, authentic conversation. It does not mean you have to agree. Now, this is the big fallacy. Agreement is a totally different thing. But the quality of finding a way to have a courageous, vulnerable, and honest conversation is one of the most missing components, I think, in much of the area of leadership. And it leads us in the directions of doubting everything, becoming cynical, and waiting for the moment that whoever is presenting themselves as nearly perfect falls. And I think it creates a weak democracy. A weak democracy. We are missing meaningful conversations. And if you want a meaningful conversation, it has to start with honesty and the courage to be vulnerable. Third, I think you have to commit to respect. Now, I'm going to go back to the Latin on this word respect because it's also a very interesting one. It comes from the word specere, the verb specere, which is to look at, or to observe, or to watch. So in English, the reason we would say spectators at a theater or at a football match is that those are people who are watching that particular event. So it's the same verb as the verb respect. Now, what respect means is respecere. That is that you turn and look again. You turn and look again. It has a real component to, now here we come into the artistic world, to the word admire. Okay, admire would be to see, admirar, but you turn and look a second time. You watch again. Now, I think where this comes into conversation, the kind that I'm trying to point to, an ethos of imagination, is that your purpose of conversation with people with whom you do not agree is not to reach agreement. It is to be in a meaningful conversation of honesty where you commit with each other to turn and look again. And again. That is that there is a process in which you may be able to understand in a new way the concerns that have come, but you may also understand in a new way what it is that you yourself were trying to say. Now, what I find, what I said earlier, that we have too many conversations that are meaningless in settings of great division. Those happen in two ways. The first is when we talk only with people with whom we agree, we end up saying the same thing over and over again. And when we talk with people with whom we disagree, we argue in ways that we don't engage in either direction. And we rarely then penetrate to a deeper level of understanding about what it is that we may, in fact, have experienced and fully want to bring forward, and what it is that they may have experienced and want to bring forward. Now, so the notion of respect is, I think a very key one, is it requires you to keep looking again, to look again, to turn and look again. So, how might you do that? I think it's the difference between a conversation where you're aimed at each other this way, and it begins to take on a conversation where you're shoulder by shoulder looking this way. So literally in the work that I'm doing, in fact, we had a little workshop yesterday, I am sending people out on walks. I think walking together with people with whom you don't agree can be one of the most revealing experiences that you will ever have. Walking, side by side and talking. First came onto this from a variety of places, not the least of which was all the studies on negotiation that said when they got away from the table and went for a walk in the garden during tea, something changed that they brought back to the table. So it brings up the question, why not just have the whole negotiation be out in the garden with tea, where you're wandering around and talking? But there is something that's shoulder to shoulder. When you're walking, your physical arrangement is one of the conversation being a forward flow, side by side, instead of an argument that's moving this way. So if you want to try something really interesting, go for a walk once a week with somebody that thinks very differently than you. Commit to it for 5 years and see what happens. The final one that I would make as the 4 commitments is the commitment to leadership for the whole. I think we have too much leadership for the part. That is, leadership that is engaged with only a portion of the much wider community that's affected. How to develop a capacity to think about imaginative leadership for the whole is one of the most challenging things that we have to face in places that are deeply divided. So I've gone past my time. Let me conclude with these very short and brief final remarks. I think the health of a democracy is rarely measured by its leaders. I think it's measured by the quality of engagement, participation, and conversation of its citizens. It is ours to forge. Waiting, demanding, or blaming gives birth to cynicism and paralysis. But take a small step, small as it may be, that opens up a conversation with people who are different in ways that are different, and you may be surprised with the kind of imagination that that begins to spark. And I think this, at essence, is the art and soul of civic leadership in a democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John Paul. I don't think we minded that he ran over time a little bit. It is just coming up to 10:15, but I want us to keep to our timetable, which means our discussions will finish at 10:30, and then we can engage in questioning and comments and so on and get a full half hour. We all live here. We can talk amongst each other later, but we want to use John Paul's time as much as we possibly can. So we've all got about 16 minutes, and then we'll start again. Yes? You know, oh, it's off, so you can switch it on now. Okay, folks, it's 10:30. We've got 30 minutes before Jean-Paul has to rush off to his catch his plane. So we can do this in numerical order, starting at either end, or we can do it if particular tables have got particularly burning questions or comments, criticisms, disagreements. So let's try the latter first. Are there any tables that have come to views or questions that, okay, let's go. Nobody willing to start? Yes, here we are, number 2.
Okay. The question is, our representatives and representative leaders are mainly male. How can more conversations from citizens in general, women, young people, and outsiders of all kinds
You should occupy the microphone, not me.
Their agenda?
Are we going to go several at a time or just one?
We've got 12 tables, which implies obviously 12 questions, and we've got 30 minutes, so 12 into 30 isn't. So maybe we could take a couple or maybe 3 questions, and then we can develop those, and then we can move on again. So do we have another over here? Yes, Brent? Is it? Sorry. I think it's Brent. Can't see you.
The mic's out here now.
Oh, right.
It's just that our question does relate somehow to the first question we would ask John Paul to reflect on the role of gender and actual experiences of women doing the vulnerability, doing the courage, and of men carrying their wounds gracefully. If you could perhaps speak to that.
We spoke about the notion of experiment and experimenting with art. And the question I want to know is, how do you help cultivate the notion of art more in our society?
Okay, let's leave 3 questions for now, and then give John Paul a chance to respond, and then we come back and pick up some more.
Yeah. I'll take the first 2 to be related to the question of participation of those who are participating less in a lot of the conversations, in particular the role of women and gender. This is a very interesting and big, wide open area of exploration, so it's hard to know which elements to pick. So I'm going to just go with my gut and tell you a couple of observations that I've had in a story or 2. I'm doing a lot of work in Nepal right now. Nepal is very far off. It's a very poor country. It's come through a 10-year civil war. They're trying to reconstruct after the civil war. It's very hierarchical. Political parties' notion of youth wings, they run up until about 60 years old. Leaders of the parties are so old they can hardly walk. I mean, I don't want this broadcast across the papers in Nepal, obviously, but the hierarchy is one that's mostly male and very highly driven within that, to have very limited places for women. So one of the areas, I'm working, among other things, with a foundation that made a 10-year commitment to peace building, which is an unusual kind of an approach to moving away from kind of the project of 1 to 2 years or cycles of 1 to 2 years. It was thinking about cycles as decades rather than thinking about cycles as projects. And one of those was to increase the participation of women in the public sphere, from rural to national. And our focus primarily began to go much more toward rural women, who were often those left in villages that had been impacted by the war, but also had the least opportunity. And what we've found that's been so intriguing is that we started with a very simple idea, and the idea was to have women gather in circles of 15 to 20 in local village levels, and that they would start their whole process by telling their life stories. And we discovered 2 or 3 things immediately. The first was the women would say, "What's a life story?" And so the people we were working with would try to explain, you know, you tell the story of who you are and what's happened in your life. And then the second question would come, who wants to know that? The block was that they did not have a notion that they would have anything of interest to share. And in the sequence of things that began to emerge, they now have come to the conviction that every meeting they start, at least one person tells a life story. And that they feel that there's something very transformative in terms of capacity to participate publicly, with a capacity to share with others that you're somebody. You're not a nobody. And this has started to evolve in ways that I don't know where it will end up in the long run. But it's reinforced for me the conviction that when you're working with especially vulnerable populations and or populations that are greatly marginalized, there's a real need, I think, to build a capacity for engagement and trust, and to slowly build the platforms for increased exposure. They just published a book about a year ago that brought together like 30 or 40 of the profiles of the women that have the least exposure nationally. One of the efforts of this has been in an area where there are a lot of what they refer to there as single women, which are women who lost husbands in the war But the areas where they're living, some lost due to the Maoist insurgency, would have killed their husbands, and some due to the national police or military that would have shot the wives of the Maoist women. But they live in the same geographic area, local area, what they call districts. And they've been working on an approach to trauma healing that is essentially storytelling. But what's coming forward from that is a different view of reconciliation, I think, in which reconciliation is understood in part as actual conversations between people who have suffered enormously but are needing to find ways of cooperating in order to survive. And so the women have started forming co-ops locally, and there often are co-ops that include people from both sides of the conflict, the divide, so to say. Now that leads to my second comment. I don't remember exactly the exact formation of the earlier one, but one of the things that I've noticed rather consistently about the role of women in a lot of peace-building efforts, with about 3 or 4 observations, so I'll make them very rapidly. The first is that they are often the most engaged people at the level of the grassroots, that they're the fiber that holds a lot of things together, the weaving that holds a lot of things together. They're the least represented at the highest political level. And this is actually pretty significantly documented. If you look at comparative peace processes and tables of negotiation, women have had an extremely low level of direct participation as negotiators, even though they may have been at the fore of some of the insurgent movements. They often are still not adequately represented. The second is that I've noticed rather consistently that women have been, in many regards, what I would refer to as the informal truth commissions. And that this takes a lot of forms, but that one of the roles that seems to be emergent in a number of locations is capacity of women to bring forward the truth about situations. This could be from the women in the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina about the abuses of the military dictatorship. It could be the form that it took in South Sudan, where they often would create the demand for and the platform for inter-clan or inter-tribal discussions. But they would openly say, we know that by our tradition, the elders of our tribes speak when we negotiate, but we will sit and listen, and if anyone speaks an untruth, we will say it. And it became a very powerful impact around the level and quality of what was exchanged between the men due to how women mobilized to bring forward what they felt were the truths that hadn't been fully engaged. I've often wondered if there's something much deeper in that that's happening, and that we ought to take a much closer look at. I mean, our notions of truth commissions have been fairly structured and somewhat rigid in the ways that they're built. There may be a lot to learn from how it is that people closest to a lot of the suffering have brought forward the particular things that need to be addressed at a much wider level. My final comment is that I think the question of equal access and wider participation is one that will enhance the sustainability of peace building if it increases the participation of women at all levels of the society. And that to the degree we still have levels of participation at high, middle to high level, both in political and governmental structures, that are not inclusive of women, I think we miss the capacity to sustain things more holistically, is my own view. Now that comes, it's a very interesting process, because sometimes as women rise into leadership, they rise into a system that requires them to behave in ways they may not behave if they were in a circle, say, in their local community. And that's the part I wish would rise more, the capacity for engaged conversation that touches more holistically on the experience of being a human being in a human community. And that we're missing that when we have only a portion of our community making the most important public decisions for life. How we get there, you know, there's a lot of mandated things from what the UN has mandated about participation of women. that are structural approaches, and I believe that those are important to put into place, but I really think it requires a commitment of the citizenry. I think it's the citizens that will ultimately make this shift. And that's where I have a great faith in the participation of women in a more robust way. My final comment is that just 2 weeks ago I met with about 10 women in the Nepal process who were quite concerned about the role of women that not being represented at all in their higher level discussions. And I said, well, you know, there's this place called Northern Ireland. And they did one very interesting thing, which was there were a few women that formed a women's party. I know it had all kinds of issues and difficulties as it came, but it was one of the few times that we saw, now I'm about to step into the hornet's nest here, but I'm going to say it because that's where I like to be anyway. It was one of the few times, by my view, that there were people at the highest level of representation who spoke in a way that spoke for the good of the whole, and not exclusively for the good of a particular, in this case, sectarian divide. And the question I was raising for the women was, if you're embedded in very narrowly defined political parties, who speaks for the whole? Is it possible for women to find a way to create the capacity to do that and bring it forward in a different way? So those are my quick comments. The experiments, I missed one word over here, Brent, that I didn't quite catch. The experiment, how to cultivate the ought. I'm sorry, I'm missing the. Give me an acronym. The art. Oh, okay. Very good. I heard ought. You know, the O-U-G-H-T, and because that brought my associational metaphor to a whole different location. So I'm going to say a word about it, and then I'll go to the art. So the question was how to cultivate the notion of the art into the civic leadership. On the ought side, O-U-G-H-T, I've noticed that a lot of times we do things because we feel obligated to do them, and it's about should. You ought to do this or you should do this. In fact, I sometimes say we get shoulded on a lot in life, and that we should be cautious of that, because if we're doing things out of a sense of being obligated or compelled, it may actually diminish the art of it. It may kill the innate spark that we need. So how to bring it in? There's a lot of different ways that one could think about this, and probably it would have to be around the area of experiments. Personally, I think the arts themselves are quite useful. I think it's very useful to incorporate music and poetry and things that may be seen as peripheral to the political process or public decision making, but to bring that increasingly into that arena where leaders are engaged in ways that they themselves understand the power that comes with creativity in one form or another. I think that it can be enormously opening for those kinds of sources to be tapped in a much deeper way. I think some of it is really a matter of both capturing a vision but also creating small disciplines. And the vision is that the difficulties and decisions that we face in leadership are very complex, and they go beyond our capacity to attend to it all in an adequate way. And what we have to cultivate is a number of things in order to live in that ambiguity. So one of them is, I've been making the case that art is a way that attends to the complexity but captures the essence. That's one of the key things that art brings. So a song or a poem, when you finished it, you will say, that artist captured something that penetrated to the very core of this topic. Even though it was complex, somehow the core of that was held. So I've been making a case with a lot of my students, for example, that analytical capacity is one capacity. It's the capacity to break things down into parts. The capacity to bring them back into a whole and to capture the essence is another capacity. And that comes much closer to the artistic side. So how to cultivate that as part of what you're doing is not always done in the academic setting. It's certainly rarely done in the political arenas. And I think those sorts of things can make a compelling case that we bring that in. So how do you do that? My little disciplines are that, among a range of them, but one is certainly that I've worked a lot with haiku poetry, and I think it's a valuable thing to do. I think but it is an endlessly deep process. It emerges out of a particular tradition, so not everyone likes it. A lot of people think it's children's poetry. I happen to think that it's one of the hardest forms of poetry to accomplish well, and it's actually a lifelong discipline, and the very essence of it is to try to capture the whole of a human experience in the fewest possible words in a very concrete way. And I think that little discipline that I personally do it, I think other people that have done it find that it contributes to something that they find has several elements that you would otherwise not completely be aware of. The first is that you start noticing things differently. So this whole notion, when I said notice earlier, I think it lifts eyes, ears, and the full of the sensation of the human experience into watching for and seeing things. The second is that it is a small discipline to take complexity into its simplest form. What I referred to in the book as, in Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s poetry, he called it the other side of complexity. Simplicity on the other side of complexity. Simplicity on this side of complexity is that you become very reductionist. And you pick a part of the complexity you most like and you build everything around that. Simplicity on the other side of complexity is you live in the ambiguity of this complex thing, but you begin to find the heartbeat, the core of it. And I think those are elements that can be cultivated, but it takes some requirement. I'm a big believer in retreats and in walking. If I was making a case of how to bring art into politics, I would make people up at Stormont go on walks together. I would have them go for an hour or two on a long walk, 2 people at a time, and I would start by saying, tell us about your family. And then I would follow that by tell us about what you're hoping for your great-grandchildren. And the last thing I would say is, tell us about what you're going to do on topic X that you're fighting about. I think we have reduced the spaces that we engage each other on complex issues to spaces that are indoors, formally around some kind of a process that often is a table or a shouting match in the worst of the conditions. And we have rarely not seen what's available to us in a much wider way of looking at it. So I wish, in the book I actually proposed it would be great if 1 week out of the year you could get politicians to plant a garden together. They'd come to a retreat, they'd spend a whole week together, they'd plant a garden. And that every night they would, well, besides drinking whiskey and whatever else they want to do, they would sing music and read poetry, things that take them out of the normal venue from which they are engaged, because we've reduced it to such a narrow part of our human experience that we can't expect the best decisions to emerge from that. But this is so contrary to what people think that it's completely out of line. I happen to believe that it may be the saving grace of what's needed. So those are quick comments. I'll go on, Brian.
One of Jean-Paul's comments that I've really taken to heart was to be open and honest and have the courage to admit your mistakes. And I misread the program this morning, and we do not have to finish with Jean-Paul at 11 o'clock. We can go on until 11:30. So I have misled myself, and I'm afraid I've misled you. So we do, in fact, have some more time. My apologies. So I think there were people somewhere over here. Yes, Fred, the talking stick is on its way.
John Paul, in his talk, spoke about our crisis, that the professional peacemakers were not actually producing the goods, but things were happening spontaneously around. And that for us raises the question, what is the role of a professional peacemaker, and in particular, what is their role in relationship to these spontaneous initiatives which are happening around them?
We'll take a couple over. Oh, right, sorry, here.
And this is a question about organisations and change. It's about organisations that are deeply resistant to internal change. And that could be organisations, governments, community groups, the word organisation is generic in this context. We asked, first of all, how do we lift horizons to enable engagement with change? And then in part answer to our question, we recognise that change begins with the individual. So how do we raise our self-esteem, our positive self-image, our courage, our commitment to enable change?
I think. Sorry, there's one, the white shirt over there, it's Sean.
Hi, similarly, this question about strategic timing. A lot of people in this group are involved in forums and similar sort of conversations. And through these conversations, people do change. Drawing attention to this can lead to retreat and retrenchment. So the question is, how and when do you draw attention to change in order to notice and bank effectiveness of the work for sponsors, enablers, bureaucrats, etc., without undermining that effectiveness?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So three, okay. These are three different ones, so I'll try to speak to them more directly so we take full advantage of the time we have. On the first, the role of the professional and what are spontaneous initiatives, there's a variety of things that I've been concerned about. And the first is that somehow the notion of professionalism has by and large reduced itself increasingly to forms of technical management. Now this isn't exclusively to our field, it's in a lot of fields that we educate we educate ourselves in ways that we narrow to kind of effective delivery of a particular product, a particular process, if you will. And so one of the things that I try to work with is the re-expansion that we're whole people. We are whole people, not part people. Part people is when I go to an office and I reduce most of who I am to a very small piece of me. And that's what I deliver. Now, so in the field of professional peacemaking, so I will make the observation so that we don't get off on the wrong foot here, that not everyone agrees with what I'm about to say in my own field, and that this is an interesting area of some back and forth discussion. My own sense is that we have overemphasized the skills around the technique of delivery of process. And we have underemphasized the capacity to think constructively about how it enters a wider flow of constructive social change. And so the strong point of that is that we have a good capacity to deliver certain kinds of technical offerings. But we may often miss or not be noticing how these are a part of a much wider process of change. And therefore we may miss opportunities to connect with things that are both spontaneous, but also to link more strategically what we're doing in ways that help to foment those, to nurture them. And so in my writing, one of the things that I promote a lot, and this to some degree comes, I think, to the second question about change, is to shift the notion toward the idea of transformation as a framing concept which permits you to think about everything from change at the personal level to the structural and cultural level, and to increase the capacity to visualize how what it is that we're doing both provides a technical expertise, but also is a part of a wider process of change. Now, this is where the spontaneous part often comes in. If your eyes are not attuned to noticing these things, you may not notice some of the most important elements that could be linked in, connected, and or encouraged where those are happening, because your notion is that you have a particular, by professional preparation, a particular niche, and it's only in that delivery that you are able to do that function. And so I think by my view, it's a limiting form of understanding professionalism, but it's also limited considerably how we have thought about our wider field. On the side of resistance to change and how to cultivate the personal, some of what I've been saying earlier today goes very much to the core of that, which is that I think simultaneously, if we don't attend to helping people become more fully human, I see a lot of what I do as finding a way back to humanity, a way back to being fully a human being in a human community. That is, that we find ways that we're healthy. And that this actually involves a good bit more than some of what we normally might attend to in the sorts of approaches that we use in organizations in the preparation of people. The part of the conviction I have is that in a much bigger picture, we all of us are in processes of healing. And we have tended to understand healing as a kind of a technical thing that happens for people who have had a particular trauma, especially in settings of conflict. And that comes through a kind of a phased approach to things that you might do to provide support. The reframing of that is that healing is a lifelong journey. And it requires us to be aware at a much deeper level of those aspects of who we are as full human beings that need constant nurturing. And so I think the elements that the art and soul point to is that it offers up the possibility that you can hold together a very strong technical capacity alongside of an artistic capacity, alongside of a deepening of your own sense of vocation and what it is that you bring to the world. And when we have those things in combination, I think it adds up to a quality of presence that has a transformative impact. And so one way to think about this is that leadership is not just about a particular set of skills, but leadership is about nurturing the quality of presence, of how you are with others and how with others you begin to understand and move toward decisions that are good for the whole. And those, I think, are enhanced to the degree that people are more deeply aware and build their capacity to recognize their own processes within that. So it'll be a small set of comments, and I'm sure we can go much further. On the, Sean, I want to come back and make sure I've understood the question. So the piece was how and when to draw attention to the change that's happening?
Yeah. Why people are repenting, treating from those changes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, change is always a little scary because it's going to require you to get out of something that you're comfortable with. You know, your context here has been enormously informative about that. I'm going to step back into the hornet's nest for a minute and explain what I mean. In one of my visits to the Maze prison in the 1990s, I came out and wrote a small poem. And the poem captured a bit of the conversation. I'm trying to think if I can capture it totally by memory, so here goes. The essence of it was that we were in a room where we were surrounded by men who were in front, below, on top of bunks, basically surrounded, in a conversation. And the part of the poem that starts is that men in tattoos served us tea, is one of the opening lines of the conversation. But the commander said, in the line that I use in particular, his line was, "My fear of peace is that I'll be back in this prison visiting my children's children at the end of the day. And I took that and wove it into a small poem. It points to some interesting things. It points, of course, to a long-term generational view of the conflict. But it also points to how over cycles these things repeat themselves. And it pointed essentially the notion of my fear of peace, because that was a phrase that he had used, and we asked, why was he afraid of peace? And part of the essence that came out of it was that it wasn't going to be sustainable, but it was also going to change everything. And it was going to cover up a lot of things. That was kind of the core of it. At a later point, there were a number of very interesting elements that started to become emergent. I think some of the graphic statistics on that were that cases of mental health counseling increased after the Troubles, not during. A lot of explanation around that, but one of them is that it's held at bay to a point that it could be opened up. There was a rather significant, at least by my interpretation, element that the Troubles provided a way of knowing who you were, provided a neighborhood that you should be in, provided a very concrete set of things that you should believe in, whether you were on one side or another. And when peace came, everything got messy and ambiguous. People weren't quite sure what it meant anymore. And so subsequently, they weren't quite sure who to be. So it was kind of an identity crisis. And one of the odd paradoxes of deep, divisive conflict is that it takes away a lot of ambiguity. It just tells you this is who you are and this is what you believe, and if you don't, you probably get killed. So you just, you hang on to that. And then when peace comes along, it opens up things and you get multiple potential interpretations of what's going on. So in reality, peace is kind of scary. Scarier than the Troubles in some regards, because the identities are much more in flux. And so one of the impulses of that is that represents a pretty significant form of change. And the change is a little scary. It pushes people to go back to what they may know best. And so what you may know best is to keep it nice and neat. One of the haikus I wrote here many years ago took a term that I heard somebody say at a table, and it went just basically like this. Maybe this is as good as it gets, peaceful bigotry. Maybe this is as good as it gets, peaceful bigotry. It was a phrase, and it was pretty much just a straight-up haiku. Sometimes you hear haikus right in the conversation. What it means is that people would resist the change that might be offered by the potential for a more engaged set of relationships, for opting to go back to something that's known. And this is the same kind of resistance that you'll find within organizations or beyond. That what's known, even if it doesn't work well, is at least known. What's the unknown is what may come. So one of the things that has to be worked with is how to reduce the level of personal and systemic anxiety about opening up conversations that have to be sustained for a long period of time, where you aren't sure what the outcome exactly will be. And I think that's, so one of the elements that we've worked with in the conflict area, and this is particularly true, I think, of organizations, but I believe it's also true of a wider social setting, is that you have to find ways to help people raise their level to handle ambiguity. That is, you're living in a state where all the answers are not yet known, because they are in development, they are in evolution. It's a process out of which none of us can fully control or predict what might be emergent. It is emergent. And that level of ambiguity sometimes can be very hard for people to handle because they want an answer yesterday. And often divisive conflict provides answers that are dysfunctional, but they're preferred over the process of living in ambiguity. So change would require people to set aside all the answers that they've had about how things are, to look more carefully at the way they may be. And that's not always easy. So how, at an organizational level, which is I think the area that you were aimed at, one of the things that I've found rather consistently helpful is that you can help people visualize a calendar. I think it can be, especially in organizations, it can be very helpful to know where you're starting and where you hope to end, and when on the calendar that would be placed, at least in a phase one, if maybe that it has iterations, but that there is clarity about ways of participating, ways of input, and a great deal of clarity about ultimate decision making, which is one of the hardest things that people have a lot of trouble with. Ultimate decision making means, is this a consensus decision where everyone who participates will participate in agreeing to the final outcome, or is this a decision that informs a director, or is this a decision that a small group will eventually bring a proposal and recommendations? And so how will the decision actually be made? Knowing that earlier and being clear about the process reduces anxiety about how the change can be done, even if it's the same period of a year or two that you may be involved in that. And when you move to a social setting, this becomes a lot more complex, because all the answers people are demanding, they want them yesterday. And so the typical process is that you try to offer things very quickly that don't really get to the deeper process, but are simply taking care of the day-to-day kinds of things. But the other element of that is that quite often in settings of deep conflict, it takes a long time for the evolution of change to be fully understood. So I'll go back to one of my arguments that I made for a long time. First time I made it was here in Belfast, and I think I almost got thrown out of the hallway that I was making this comment in. But I said, it takes as long to get out of a conflict as it took to get into it. And nobody wanted to hear the 32-year theory. So that wasn't fully, I think, fully appreciated. But I don't have any empirical evidence to scientifically justify what I said. I just believe it, which is what Stephen Colbert calls truthiness in his comedy show. What it suggests is that it's very hard to measure change if you're using a lens that can only see a few months or a year or two. You have to think across much bigger blocks to notice certain things. And I think that's been one of the harder things to, especially in settings of protracted conflict, like this one represents, is that we are so captivated by the immediacy that it's not always easy to take a step back and take a bigger picture of what's happening. And then we may well miss that there are some very interesting things that, even though last week it went backwards, the whole is moving in a different direction. Or to see particular gaps that may be most useful to give attention to help the support of the kind of changes that are aspired to. I don't know if this is getting at what you were after, but yeah. In Nepal right now, for me, it's really interesting because the international donor agencies, by and large, have a project mentality of 1 to 2 years, and then they may renew them for the next year or two. But if you look at Nepal, their peace agreement, there's small and big. Their peace agreement was signed 5 years ago, and the 5th anniversary was just a few weeks back. And in their original agreement, they said that the major parts of the agreement would be accomplished in 6 months, and the biggest piece of the agreement would be accomplished in 2 years. Okay? The major part of the military side was that all the people fighting would be integrated into one army, right? And the bigger piece, which was going to take 2 years, was they were going to rewrite the Constitution. We're 5 years, they've not integrated any of they're just in the final process of getting them out of the cantonments, and the Constitution has not yet been written. Now, a lot of people would make the argument, well, the politicians are all hung up in their issues and they haven't done their work, which is partially true. This is part of complexity. Everything has a bit of truth. The other part of it is that Nepal is going through a 500-year, maybe a 2,000-year change. What kind of time will be needed for them to think about, for example, the impact on caste structures, the impact of no longer being a Hindu monarchy, the impact of not having an army that reports to the king, but reports to the elected leadership, the impact of federalism, where local populations have more of a voice in there. These are things that defy a one-year project. And they, in fact, have defied the comprehensive peace agreement that was speculated to take 2 years to complete. And so how you look at change, you can place a lot on resistance, but you could also stand back and say, you know, this kind of change is going to create a lot of ambiguity. People are not going to know what end is up for a while. And it's going to take a while to figure out how and in which way this will move, and how do we help that along as part of the bigger process. Brian, we go back to more questions. So.
Sorry, have you?
No, I'm fine. So let's go, Ken.
Yeah. John Paul, this question is written in the first person, but we would ask you to speak to all of the I's here. How do I change people's attitudes from I can't to I can?
Mm-hmm.
Have we a couple more? One at the back there. And Peter also. So Peter here and then one at the back.
We just had a good conversation and didn't really have a question, but thought we ought to come up with something. So, on the back of the last question, I think where we got to in our conversation, the last thing we said was, how do you deal with the cynics? And I framed the question as, have you experienced or a story where people helped each other to do it, to be human in a professional context or an individual organization?
Yeah.
Thank you. Our question is quite similar to that. So we're very aware that you talked about commitment to the vulnerabilities and society and respect and whatnot, but we're very aware that we're within given situations not everybody else is playing by the same rules. And it is that question about how do we sustain that commitment where we're in those situations day in, day out, feeling as individuals we're not necessarily getting anywhere.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know, very good questions. On the first one, I don't have an easy recipe. I wish I did. I think the key is, and I don't know in what context you might have been talking about. It might be within institutions. It might be within the wider social setting or with vulnerable groups. It could be taken a lot of different ways. I think if it's within institutions, one of the keys is to find ways to open the parameters that give people possibility to explore without having to assure that what they come up with will be the adequate answer that produces everything. In other words, it's I call it the prototype or the experimental approach in terms of the way that you might approach, say, a donor on some of this. So you're going to run a pilot project. Okay, so as soon as you use the word pilot, a donor could say, okay, I understand that what you're doing is you're exploring an area that will lead to that. Now, what I think is key on this is to create an emphasis on some learning, and that rather than on product, and that the learning can go very much in the direction that there is space to think about who we are and what we bring that enhances the personal capacity, but it also has a capacity to contribute to organizational learning in very concrete ways. Now, the shift from I can't to I can, I think, is that people need a space where it's possible to try. And if the parameters are set such that they run an enormous risk of anything that can run from embarrassment to getting their fingers slapped for trying, they very quickly will revert back to an I can't mentality. So part of it has a structure. The second piece that I want to emphasize is I think this works much better in teams than individuals. There's a component about teamwork that permits people to simultaneously work together but also grow as individuals. And it helps lower the risk of I can not to I can. It lowers the risk if you have a small set of people that together are doing things but where there are shared responsibilities, et cetera. That, I think, makes for much more of a supportive environment to have that feel. The third is a concept that I would refer to that I think we have underestimated in a lot of our work in peace building, which is the concept of accompaniment. And accompaniment is quite different than facilitation or mediation. Accompaniment is a kind of an alongsideness. Alongsideness is never accepted in my word dictionary. They don't like the way that it's spelled or something. So I've been trying to put this word forward as a word to invent. What alongsideness connotes is a form of leadership that is neither ahead of or behind. So there's basically two ways that leadership often happens when you conceptualize. The first is that leadership happens by going out ahead and others follow. The other is that the leaders, give the orders and/or give the mandate and say, go do, and then they're behind as a kind of a backstopping or the place where it comes back to when it's received. Alongsideness says that we actually are engaged in something that will be side by side and that we're learning together. And I think that form of leadership in especially settings where there's a great deal of vulnerability about capacity, is a very useful one, because it means that each person has to take their step, but there is a sense of a container that holds a space that's safer. So how to create the sense of safety as you're proceeding. Often then create the moments where people begin to realize a deeper capacity. In fact, can have some very significant kinds of breakthroughs. It'd be interesting to hear more of where your context was on that, but that's a quick run on it. How to deal with cynics. Where did that one come from? I'm trying to remember Peter O'Reilly. Yes. I've always, there are a couple of things about cynics. First, they're often using a great deal of humor as a way to deflect the pain. And the way they use the humor is they put their finger right in the worst wound you got. It's like, it says, little of any of this will matter. That's kind of how it makes its argument. I've often understood for me, there's several layers to this. So I think there's very little to do in a direct form that's constructive. Any kind of direct confrontation of that is basically useless. So it's much more to understand how to come alongside of it. Same thing I was saying earlier. Because the layers that I see is that cynicism, or a cynic, so to say, is an idealist who no longer believes in hope. Okay? So it's a person who actually had a great deal of hope but no longer believes it's possible. And so the best way to protect the pain of what I had dashed over and over again is to become very cynical about anything changing. So the alongsideness is that cynicism often gives you a gift. As in my book I called There Was the Gift of Pessimism. You could equally write a chapter called The Gift of Cynicism. And the gift of cynicism is that sometimes they just penetrate right to the absolute core of where the real issue is. And what bothers us about them is that they're, you say, damn it, they're right. And then you don't know quite what to do with it. So the gift is that sometimes the cynic has a penetrating view, of the fact that a lot of things are happening over and again, so why think they're going to change? And they can state them in ways that kind of capture. Now, the challenge of that is how to find a way to reinvigorate the hope. And I think the basic reason for cynicism quite often is it's a self-protective device. It's a self-protective device. And so what matters most is safety, by my view. So any kind of confrontation or arguing with it is counterproductive. But going with it and saying, you know, you're exactly right, and finding a way then from within that, over time, to reinfuse it with some hope that something can be done, I think is one way to approach it. Now, if it's intra-organizational, it's often about a lack of hope that the organization will do anything useful, or it's a loss of faith in the institutional goals or the leadership. And so they can have an undermining effect that permeates. And that becomes a challenge of, by my view, I don't think isolation strategies work. In other words, that you try to push people to the edges so that they don't do as much. I think the opposite is true. You would bring them as close in as you could to the processes that are happening and the decision-making that's happening. And that is, in part, a way to reinfuse some level of hope. But I think the biggest thing for me is to remember, you know, the nature that it's often about mechanisms of safety, and so how to create safe environments becomes absolutely key for that. So, the last question on the back, I think it was around what if not everybody's playing by the same rules? Is that, yeah? Which, and I don't know again what level of context we were thinking of, whether it's organization or the wider society. There's no real shortcuts on that. I mean, circumventing rules is a form of seeking power inappropriately. Inappropriately in the sense that it is an attempt to gain power without needing the consensus of others. In other words, it's done by circumventing the ways that are available for doing that. And it raises then numerous questions. So it's not exclusively to those that are, if you will, not playing by the rules, that they are the ones that need to change. One of the questions it raises is, how is the system set up to permit them to participate? And if the systems, you know, can be organizational otherwise, if the systems are not set up where they have clear points of information, access to it, clear points of participation, et cetera, then it may be that shifts in how you're establishing that can shift the dynamic of some of the not playing by the rules. If it's in a much wider social arena, it's often about people feeling that their aspirations are not taken into account in terms of the direction that a wider society is going, and that they've lost a capacity to find other means to do it. Now, one of the things that's particularly challenging about that, and it comes back a lot to power. I think this really is related a lot to power. And we have that famous phrase, you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You all know that one. So let's go to the opposite equation. Powerlessness is the seedbed of violence. When people feel powerless, when they feel they have no other means by which to attain the things that they feel deeply about, they often revert to forms that become quite, have expressions of violence which can be directed at a personal level. It could be forms of suicide, for example. You feel deeply powerless. Or it can be in the totally opposite of that, in a very disruptive behavior within an organization, or in a wider social setting, it can be forms of how and why they justify the use of violence. Now, again, it offers up multiple ways of thinking about how processes are linked, not a single one. So one set of questions says, how is the system set up so that it can engage and include, and find ways to do that people feel is adequate? And the second is, how do we engage the pursuit of goals that don't have to rely on violence? And that is, you know, more often than not about forms of inclusion and conversation. And this is one of the challenges, because people who don't play by the rules are the ones we least like to talk to. In fact, they often are the most critical. If it's an organizational thing, they're often critical. I think one of the things to remind yourself as leaders within an organization, if that's part of what you, is that people who are highly critical of you There's two ways to understand that. The first way is to say, this person doesn't like me, they're going to do everything to undermine me, and this person's a threat to me. The other way is to understand that criticism is a form of pursuit. This person wants a relationship with me, wants a relationship to the ways in which the organization works. And if you can understand criticism as a form of pursuit, you may be able to reframe how you engage that person. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier, I think at least, and that is finding spaces of meaningful conversation. And if that's true at a much wider social level, it's also true of an intra-organizational one. Now, I think I am up against my time, Brian, unless you've decided that we've got another half hour.
If only, if only.
Yeah.
I think I can speak on behalf of everyone without any hesitation in thanking you very much,
Yeah, you're most welcome.
Jean-Paul, both for your talk and also for this very fruitful engagement with questions and comments and so on. The issue of leadership, civic leadership in particular, I think perhaps if we see the mess that the so-called able leaders have made politically and economically and business-wise and so on, this will maybe help us to overcome our fear, anxiety, hesitation, shyness, or whatever it is, to step forward and exercise some leadership ourselves. So thank you again very much indeed. And obviously we're going to take a break now, and then we'll have Paul Arthur to talk to us after the coffee break, which, if I am right in reading the program, is in 30 minutes at 12 noon. Thank you all very much. Thanks a lot. That was great.